Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Chris from AppSumo with the Remote Work Academy, and I am overwhelmed with joy to be interviewing James Clear. If you guys don't know James, you absolutely should. You can check out his book, Atomic Habits, which is absolutely incredible. And yeah, we're going to get going in just a second. A couple pieces of housekeeping before we do. One, there will absolutely be a replay of this, so if you have to pop out early for any reason, we'll get that over to you. And number two, if you have any questions for James, you can drop those in the Q&A box, and we will circle around to some of those towards the end. But James, thank you very much for joining us today.
Of course, good to talk to you.
So for everyone here, let me introduce you a bit. So James is a writer and speaker focused on habits, decision making, and continuous improvement. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller Atomic Habits. His work has appeared in Entrepreneur Magazine, Time Magazine, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, as well as CBS This Morning. His website, jamesclear.com, receives millions of visitors each month and hundreds of thousands of subscribers to his popular email newsletter. He is a regular speaker at Fortune 500 companies, and his work is used by coaches and players in the NFL, NBA, and MLB. So that is incredible. And I guess last count I saw, the book has sold 1.3 million copies. Is that right?
Yeah, we'll hit 2 million here soon, probably sometime in the next month or two. Yeah, it's been a wild ride. So thanks for the introduction. It's very kind.
Yeah. How does that feel crossing like the million and getting close to the 2 million? Like what's the atomic habits that got you there?
Well, I mean, in a sense, the book sort of wrote itself. And what I mean is like I had to build a writing habit in order to write the book. So like I had to practice a lot of the principles just to make it come to fruition to begin with. So that was kind of cool. I like writing about topics that I have to live out, because I worry about being like a new age version of like an academic in the ivory tower where you kind of like sending out ideas, but you're not really implementing them. And I think there's a gap between theory and practice. And so as much as possible, I try to practice the stuff that I write about so that I know what it feels like to fail or to struggle or to, have a good idea. And then turns out it doesn't work that well in practice or whatever. So in that sense, I view myself and my readers as peers. We're all kind of like working through it together. And the only difference is when I come across an idea that I feel like works well, I write about it and share it. So for the most part, we're all kind of doing the same sort of thing. But yeah, it feels good. It's depending on how you measure it. The book took somewhere between 3 and 6 years, and it was my primary focus for pretty much that entire time. So that's a lot of effort and energy to put into something up front. Books are kind of weird that way, where like all the gratification is delayed. If you're willing to spend a couple years reading and researching, then refining and writing the ideas, and then, submitting the manuscript and doing a marketing plan and recording a bunch of interviews. If you're willing to like do all of that and then you sell the first copy, then it can be really great. But it is a struggle in the beginning to have all that delayed gratification. So now it feels really good. At various points in the process, it felt really bad. I probably have felt about every way that you could feel about a book at some point over the last 5 years, just at varying moments. But it's certainly been a fun ride recently.
Yeah. And I guess one of the big things that you talk about is the like goals versus systems. And I guess you could have the goal of selling 1 million copies of a book versus how do you build the systems around actually getting a book out? Were there particular ones that you were focused on, or was it just like constantly evolving?
Yeah, there was a lot of that. Like the way that I define that is your goal is your desired outcome. Your system is the collection of daily habits that you follow. And so throughout that entire process, there was a lot of reminding myself to return to the daily habits. Okay, let's, even if you work on the book for 8 hours today, it's still going to be a mess and the manuscript's not going to be finished, but that's all right. Like you don't focus on the goal, focus on the system of writing or focus on the system of recording another interview or whatever. So there was a lot of that, of reminding myself to try to do that. And I didn't always do a great job, but it kind of helped pull me back to center whenever I could think of that. Um, I suppose that, certainly you could set a goal to sell 1 million copies. I don't know how reasonable, I don't think any author could reasonably expect a book, regardless of the amount of work that you do, to take off like that. It also depends a little bit on like timeline. Are we talking about 1 million copies in a year or in like 20 years? That I think timeline is longer, then yeah, you could probably find ways to make that happen. So anyway, I would say that the book has outpaced my expectations, even though my expectations were high and I wanted to do everything I could to make it a success. But certainly throughout that whole process and timeline, as you mentioned, I like try to return to those systems and those daily habits. And that's kind of a core part of my philosophy, not just, I mentioned this in Atomic Habits, but not just for the book, but also just like how I run my business. This idea that you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And that's kind of like one of the central philosophies for me, is trying to return to those daily habits, return to that system, and just run that as much as possible and kind of let the results take care of themselves.
Yeah. And one of the other things that you mentioned is this idea of like, if you have a goal and then you hit that goal, then you're just kind of stuck at that point. Like, where do you go from there? Versus if you have this continual system, the system
Right.
can continue and improve and go on. There's not just like a set point or goal at the end of all this.
Yeah, this is probably useful. So like, goals are not completely useless. Before I criticize them, I should say, like, they're helpful for certain things. Like, goals are good for setting a sense of direction, for having like clarity around what direction you want to move in. They're also good as a filtering mechanism. If you know what your goal is, then someone can come to you and they can say, hey, I have this new opportunity, or would you like to join me for this project or whatever. But when you hear that, you can be like, run it through that filter. Does this help me achieve my goal or not? And if it doesn't, then you don't have to worry about doing it anymore. You can like filter it out, right? So that part, in that sense, goals can be helpful. However, there are a couple things. One of them, which you just mentioned, which goals kind of like they sort of create these weird after effects of these weird, like what I call sometimes like a yo-yo effect. So you set a goal to run a half marathon, and so you train for 6 months, and then you run the race, and then afterward you're like, oh great, I accomplished my goal. And then you turn around, you take like a week off, then a week turns into a month, and a month turns into 2 months, and then before you know it, you're like, man, I haven't run in like 10 weeks. Like I gotta set a new goal, I gotta sign up for another race or something. So people are kind of, the pendulum is swinging back and forth, they're kind of yo-yoing on and off. Whereas if instead, rather than focusing on the goal, you focus on the system, or what I recommend in the book is this concept called identity-based habits. Focus on being that kind of person. Rather than making the goal running a half marathon, the real goal is to become a runner, because then you finish the race, but you're like, well, I'm still going to run next week because I'm a runner, not because I only did this because I was working toward the half marathon. So, yeah, I think that for the most part, goals only change your life for the moment, whereas systems are something that is a lifestyle. It's not a momentary thing. It's something you revisit again and again. So that's kind of another way to distinguish between the two, and why I feel like focusing on systems is important.
Are systems and habits interchangeable, or is a system like a set of habits? How do you differentiate the two?
Yeah, that's probably a good way to describe it. Some of this is just semantics, and it's more like, are you moving yourself in the right direction? But yeah, I think generally speaking, a goal is like a point or an outcome, and a system is a process that you follow. And we could probably call that, rather than, you could say that like a single habit is like a sort of a mini system. But generally, I think about it as a collection of habits. And this is something that I mentioned near the end of the book, this idea that the holy grail of habit change, of behavior change, is not a single like 1% improvement. It's 1,000 of them. You're like layering them on top of each other. And this is one of the reasons why I chose the title Atomic Habits, because the word atomic has 3 different meanings. The first meaning is tiny or small, like an atom. And I do think habits should be small and easy to do. The second meaning is the one that we're talking about right now, which is an atom can also mean a fundamental unit in a larger system, like atoms build into molecules, molecules build into compounds, and so on. And so you sort of take each little habit, and they're like the atoms of your life. You like put them together in this larger system. And then the third meaning is the source of immense energy or power. And I think if you combine all 3 of those, then you sort of understand the narrative arc of the book. You make changes that are small and easy to do. You layer them on top of each other like units in a larger system, and then you can get some really powerful results if you're able to do that and sustain that. So that's kind of the core arc of Atomic Habits.
So I've been reading Atomic Habits back and forth with Principles by Ray Dalio, and I find that there's so much like complementary nature between the two of them, where he talks about like stepping outside of the system and seeing like you as a worker as well as you as a manager, and that's a lot similar to what you're talking about. And one of the things that I was reading this morning in Principles that I think I would love to get your take on this is how you talk about doing like the annual reviews and the integrity reports in how you could basically use that to like move up to your higher level thinking of like decision maker in structuring and designing your life, so that then like the worker version of you can go about for the next 6 months and kind of execute on these things. But I'd love to hear kind of how you do those and what you would recommend for those annual reports or annual reviews and integrity reports.
Yeah, yeah. I like his concept, that kind of idea of like you're both the general and the soldier, the executive and the employee. You're this kind of you step outside and above, and you're the strategist, and then you step in and you're the action taker. And so I generally think about Atomic Habits as more on that action taker side, more on that the soldier than the general side, or the employee than the manager side. It's like, how do I take action? How do I implement? How do I execute effectively? And then even right now on the back end, I'm kind of thinking about a lot of ideas that I would say are more on the strategic side, more in the big picture thinking piece. However, what you're mentioning is like the annual review and the integrity report. And those are two processes that I do each year that I would categorize them under like the bucket of habits that you could call reflection and review. And reflection and review could be something really quick and short, like keeping an exercise journal and you write down each set. And so that's happening right then in the moment. Or it could be something bigger picture and long, like an annual review that I do at the end of each year, where I kind of take more of a big picture view, write down how many workouts I've done, how many articles I've written, how many new places I visited, all that kind of whatever's important to me. But the purpose of either of those reports is to have sort of a big picture check-in to see if I have alignment between who I say I want to be and what I'm actually doing. So in the case of the integrity report, I usually do those each summer. And the general idea is there are kind of like three questions or three sections. First section is, what are my principles? What are my values? What do I stand for? Second piece is, how did I live by those? So it's kind of a chance to pat yourself on the back over the last year. And then the third question is the important one, which is, where did I fail to live up to those? And what I've started to learn, or the conclusion I've come to through doing these for a few years is, you're not going to find really anybody who says, yeah, I'm not a person of integrity. Like pretty much everybody thinks that they have integrity, right? And so how do people get into situations where there's a mismatch, where between they thought they were a person of integrity, but it turns out they did this bad thing? Usually I feel like it's a gradual slide. It's a series of like just this once exceptions where you're like, well, this time it's a little bit different, or, like, yes, usually I do that, but it makes more sense to do it this way. And so the integrity report is sort of a chance to try to like cut that off or curtail that a little bit and just pull yourself back to center and be like, all right, look, you said you were a person who cared about these values and principles. Are you actually living by that? And the other piece is, I think this is a Ray Dalio quote where he talks about this, evolution is crucial. Like you either evolve or you die, basically. And I would say, although it probably doesn't happen often, that can happen with your principles and values. Like people grow throughout time and the world changes and your life changes. And so you need to be willing to evolve and adjust your principles as time goes on. And so that yearly check-in sort of gives you a chance to do that, where like, it's not like you do a what are my core values exercise one time at a retreat, and then that locks you in for the next 20 years for what your core values are. They should be something that's revisited repeatedly. So that's the purpose of the integrity report. And then the annual review, which happens 6 months later for me at the end of the year, end of December, beginning of January. That's sort of a chance to it's more of a counting process. So the integrity report is more like, what are my principles, sort of qualitative. The annual report is more quantitative. How many workouts did I do? How many places did I visit? How many articles did I write? How many people visited the website, et cetera? And the point of counting those numbers is not really to like obsess over the number as much as those numbers should provide evidence that you are in fact moving toward the things that you said in your integrity report or whatever. So they're both just chances to check in and kind of recalibrate a little bit.
And I think what's also interesting about that is, I forget where I heard it, but the idea that like you have memories in order so you don't fall into the same hole twice. And so this is an opportunity not just to let yourself off the hook, but to see where you did have those stumbling blocks, and then you can build it back into your system or your habits and routines going forward. So you don't have to carry around that baggage of the mistakes you made. If you can identify them, address them, revise your systems, and then you can move forward without that.
Yeah, that's a good point. An unexamined failure remains a failure, but an examined one can become a success. But you need to be willing to recap and edit and refine and revisit those mistakes so that you can then revise and get feedback and update for the next time.
Mm-hmm. One of the concepts that I think is really important for people who are juggling a million things is this idea of motion versus action. I'd love to kind of hear that concept laid out.
Yeah. So the core idea here is that not all actions are equal, and there are some things that you do that are purely like preparation for the things that can get you an outcome. So the one way I would define it is you're doing something or you are in motion when you're taking actions that cannot lead to the result that you desire. However, you are in action. So when you're taking an action that can lead to the desired outcome. So as an example, if you go to the gym and you talk to a trainer, it doesn't matter how many times you talk to a trainer, that's never going to get you in shape. So that's motion. Whereas getting under the bar and doing 10 squats can actually get you in shape. And so that's action. So that doesn't mean that you should never talk to a trainer or that preparation is not useful, but it does mean that if you find yourself in the stage where your planning has become a form of procrastination, then you're planning too much, right? You're just kind of locked in motion. It's like that line about like, don't confuse motion with action. Like a rocking horse or rocking chair is always in motion, but it never goes anywhere. And, so they're different things. So that's kind of how I define distinguish between the two.
Yeah. And that seems to line up well with those kind of semi-annual reviews and integrity reports where like those can be the motion where you're kind of getting the pieces in place, but not actually doing anything. And then those 6 months in between are where you're executing on everything.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It doesn't mean that planning or review is never necessary, but just that they should not be your only focus. Mm-hmm. And perhaps they should just be occasional check-ins and things. Also, the other nice thing about that is reflection and review gives you a chance to troubleshoot other areas where you might be in motion, right? Like when you do your annual review, you realize, wow, actually I wasted a lot of hours or I wasted a lot of days on this stuff that actually is not going to get a result. So it's sort of a way to troubleshoot or pinpoint some of those mistakes that you might be making elsewhere.
How do you keep track of everything? So I was going through one of your annual reviews and you list out like all the places, all the cities you've been to and all your favorite restaurants in different countries. Like, are you going back through your calendar and reviewing it, or are you keeping track of that stuff in the moment? What's the system for that?
Yeah, the restaurants one is more just an insight into like something that I find really enjoyable and as a hobby and probably spend too much time tracking because I got like a spreadsheet of all my favorite restaurants.
Okay.
But all the other stuff actually isn't as hard as you would think. Traveling places, I don't keep track of it. I just look back on my calendar and can see where I was, and then I add it up at the end of the year. So that takes 15 minutes for me to do once a year. Workouts, I use a physical workout journal where I write down each set. It's kind of interesting because it doesn't really inform me that much when I'm working out on any given day. I'm really just kind of doing it because it's part of the habit of being in the gym and it sort of helps me show up and like get through the workout. But at the end of the year, they're all there for me. So I can go back and pick up the notebook and go through everything. Articles, I don't have to track. I can just look at what I published on the website and go back and look at the archives. So that's kind of automatically there. Website visitors is automatically tracked with Google Analytics, email opt-ins, all that kind of stuff. Like software does a lot of the work, sort of. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned this in Atomic Habits as well, which is measurement can be very powerful because it gives you feedback. It gives you really what you're looking for is it gives you a signal of progress. So something like a habit tracker, which is just you put an X on the calendar each day that you do a habit. It's very simple, but it gives you some visual feedback on your habits that you otherwise wouldn't get. One of the challenges with habits, and this is a hallmark of any compounding process, which is the greatest returns are delayed, right? Like at the beginning of the curve, you're just at the flat portion of the curve. You haven't hit that hockey stick growth yet. All the great returns of working out are 2 years from now or 5 years from now. They're not today. Like you do, if you do a workout, your body looks exactly the same at the end of the workout. It doesn't, you have no noticeable difference. So because you're waiting for those long-term rewards to accumulate, you need some visual signal that, hey, I showed up and I did the right thing, right? This was worth it. And so habit tracking can be a good way to do that. So measurement is very powerful because it can give you a signal of your progress in the moment. However, the downside of it is that now instead of building one habit, I just want to build the habit of going to the gym, you have to build two. I got to build the habit of going to the gym and of writing down the workout. And so whenever possible, I recommend automating the measurement, whether it's software or whatever. Or doing it in a way that like writing down where I'm traveling, I need to have that on my calendar anyway. So it's kind of like a painless way to track it. I'm entering it, but I'm not really thinking about it as measurement. So as much as possible, finding strategies like that make it much easier to get that signal of visual progress without asking yourself to build multiple habits.
Mm-hmm. One of the pieces that I found most helpful, particularly now where just trapped inside and fallen off of my workout routine and all that, as I was going back through Atomic Habits, and you talk about the idea of like this negative compound interest where it hurts more to skip something than it is to do it. Like the failure hurts more than the success helps. And I think that's like a really great way to be able to motivate yourself to do a terrible workout versus skipping and being like, I'll do 2 a day tomorrow.
Right. Yeah. This is, it doesn't always work exactly like this, but this experience, the philosophy or the approach of it is what people feel a lot of the time. So, for example, the math on it, let's say you have $150. If you drop by a third, so 33% decline, now you're down to $100. But if you want to get back up to $150 again, you have to increase by 50%, not by 33%. So the losses hurt you more than the gains help you. You need an increased gain to get back to where you were than compared to the loss. Mm-hmm. And again, life is not exactly like that mathematical equation, but if you think about your habits sort of in a similar way, the days where you don't really feel like working out, those are usually the days that are like the most important ones because they build the capacity to do the work on the days where you feel good. And they reinforce the type of person that you're becoming. So this is another one of the core ideas in Atomic Habits. This is a concept of, I call it identity-based habits, but the summary is every action you take is like a vote for the type of person you want to become. And so no, doing one push-up does not transform your body, but it does cast a vote for I'm the type of person who doesn't miss workouts. And no, writing one sentence does not finish the novel, but it does cast a vote for I am a writer. And the more that you cast up votes, the more you build evidence of being that kind of person. And I think in the long run, that really counts for a lot. Like those days where you don't feel good and you don't have that much energy and like it's a struggle to get a little bit of work done, or meditating for 1 minute was actually a big accomplishment because you were busy and didn't really have much time. On any individual day, those moments are easy to dismiss, but in the long run, casting votes for being that kind of person, reinforcing your desired identity really counts for a lot. So in that sense, I think making sure that you don't miss, and the days that you don't miss are more important than your peak performances, because they give you evidence of the type of person that you're becoming, and that helps you maintain it for the long run.
Yeah. And the way you round that out is to win an election, you don't have to win 100% of the votes, but you got to get more votes towards the identity you want than otherwise.
Right. No, you don't need a unanimous vote in any election, right? You just need to reinforce or to win a majority. And so, whoever you are right now to a certain degree, your identity has been shaped by the habits that you've been performing. Your habits are kind of how you embody a particular identity. Any morning that you make your bed, you embody the identity of someone who's clean and organized. Any time that you send out an email to your list, you embody the identity of someone who is a marketer. Anytime that you do one push-up, you embody the identity of someone who is an athlete. And so the way that you think about yourself has kind of been reinforced by the actions you've been taking. And so my argument is that, and this is a little bit different than what you often hear things like fake it till you make it. I don't necessarily have anything wrong with fake it till you make it. It's asking you to believe something positive about yourself. However, it's asking you to believe something positive without having evidence for it, right? And we have a word for beliefs that don't have evidence. We call it delusion. At some point, there's this mismatch between what you've been saying you are, or how you're saying you're acting, and what you're actually doing. So my argument is to let the behavior lead the way, to let doing 1 minute of meditation, or writing one sentence, or doing one push-up, or reading one page, to let that give you evidence of being a meditator or a writer or an athlete or a reader or whatever it is. So ultimately, I think that's the real power that habits have. We often talk about habits as like this pathway to external results. Oh, they'll help you lose weight or make more money or reduce stress. And it's true. Habits can do all those things. And that's great. That's a great outcome. But the real reason that I think habits matter is they can reshape your sense of self. They can give you this new identity to believe in.
So for that identity-based habits, one of the things that I guess came up when I was reading that is, how do you balance that like internally versus externally? So if you want to build the habit of, say, being a writer, being an author or something like that, how do you do that from like day one without just kind of sounding like a fool to the people you're talking about, where they're like, no, I am an author now, or I'm a writer now. And it's like, you've written one blog post. Like, how do you balance that kind of socially?
Yeah. So there are kind of two interesting points here. So the first is, I don't think there's any way to cheat the process or to convince yourself that you are something when you've only done it once or twice. I think it's a gradual thing. It's kind of like, you go out to the court and you shoot some free throws. Well, the first day you do it, you don't really think of yourself as a basketball player. But at some point, maybe it's 6 months later, maybe it's 2 years later, you cross this invisible threshold and you're like, yeah, I guess maybe being a basketball player is like kind of part of my identity. So I think that it takes time. And the reason it takes time is those votes need to accumulate. You're that day you cast the first vote, you haven't won the election. You don't have a majority yet. You're competing against your history, your lifetime of casting other votes. So you need time for the evidence to build up. Mm-hmm. But the other piece of it, which is also interesting, is that we not only reinforce or understand our identity based on our own actions, we also understand our identity based on the feedback we get from the people around us. So, everybody has had this experience, or, some variant of it, where, you're a little kid, you go to school, you're in 2nd or 3rd grade or something, you're hanging out with your friends, and you can kind of you start to go around the group and kind of triangulate your position. Oh, he's the funny one. She's the pretty one. Maybe I'm the smart one, or maybe I'm the kind one, or whatever, right? Like you kind of figure out where you fit relative to the feedback that you're getting from other people and the rest of the social group. And all of that also reinforces your identity. So I think the answer to your question is, there's not an easy quick fix early on. You got to keep casting votes and start to build up evidence on your own end. But the other piece is, you should also use that social environment to your benefit. And I think the way to do that, peer pressure can be positive or negative. It just depends on what peers you're around, right? And so as much as possible, you want to join a group, to join a tribe where your desired behavior is the normal behavior. Because if it's normal in that, if it's normal in that group, then it's going to be very desirable, very attractive for you to stick to over the long run. So as an example, when I first started out as an entrepreneur, I didn't have any entrepreneurs in my family, so I didn't really have anybody to look to. I had one friend who was a DJ, but I feel like everybody's got a friend who's a DJ, so it's kind of like, that doesn't really.
We got one at AppSumo.
Yeah, it's not a competitive advantage. So I didn't really know who to look to. And so over the first 3 months, I put together a list, a spreadsheet of a bunch of people who were doing what I wanted to be doing, who had similar businesses, were in kind of the same space. And over those first 3 to 6 months, I reached out to all of them and just sent them an email and said, hey, I'm working on this project, and sent a link to my website. I love the work that you're doing at your place. Maybe we could get together and chat. I'd just love to trade ideas and hear about what you're doing and what you're working on, and how I can support it or whatever. And honestly, most people didn't get back to me. Let's say I emailed 100 people, probably 30 got back to me or something. But after those first 6 months, now I suddenly had 30 people who I knew that were already entrepreneurs and doing the thing I wanted to do. And so now suddenly I had a little bit of a tribe where what I was hoping to do was like more normal. And then I went to my first conference a couple months after that, and maybe like 5 of those people were there attending. And so now I already had a relationship with them. So then I could go up and say hello, and we could meet in person, and I had people to hang out with. It's a little bit of legwork in the beginning, but just getting into the space where those habits are normal, I think that provides a lot of social reinforcement for the identity you're trying to build. And then you have your own side, the internal side of showing up and performing the habit.
Awesome. I felt like some of the candy in the book was when you talk about the one-time actions, where it's like, oh, I don't have to build this whole new habit. I can find ways to automate little pieces of it. Do you have any of those kind of favorite one-time habits or one-time actions to kind of trigger this cascade effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been thinking more about it recently. I don't have like a full list right here that I just read off to you, but I do think the principle is really powerful. This idea of what is a one-time action that I perform that then continues to pay off again and again. Or another way that I've rephrased it recently is, what is the work that keeps working for me once it's done? So as an example, I've done a bunch of interviews to talk about atomic habits. Some of them have been on the radio. Well, let's say I spend an hour doing that interview. As soon as I get off air, that work is done. It's no longer working for me because it's been played. It was not recorded. It was a one-time hit. Now it's done. Meanwhile, I could have spent that same hour talking about similar concepts for a podcast, but it gets recorded. And there are people who, even right now, as I'm talking to you, they're listening to some other interview that I did on a different podcast. And so that's an example of, it's the same action on my end, but just by doing it on a recorded show versus a live one, now suddenly the work is still working for me after it's done. And so I like things like that allow you to leverage or multiply yourself a little bit more. I think as much as possible, the way that if you can find those sort of opportunities, you end up magnifying your impact, magnifying your efficiency, magnifying the output of those habits over time. So anyway, so that's one example. But it's not just with business stuff. It's not just with like software or digital or media, stuff that like scales across the internet. There are also a lot of one-time actions that you take that you don't even really think about as much, but they can pay off again and again. So like taking the time to find a mattress that you really love, that can pay off every night. Now you get a better night's sleep. Or for me, I really sleep well if it's a dark room. So buying blackout curtains, one-time action, boom, all of a sudden every night I'm sleeping better. Another one that I think is often overlooked is, I guess I could just call it like interviewing. You should interview more people, and for things that you don't usually think about interviewing people for. We wanted to get some landscaping done at our house. Well, you should interview like 3 or 4 landscapers, not just like whoever the local one is that's next to you, right? And then you find who the best one is or who you resonate with. You can just, if you talk to 3 or 4 of them, you can just tell at least which one is like in the top half, even if you don't know for sure that they're the best, and then go with that one. Same thing with all kinds of decisions that you make. Plumbers, if you're finding a therapist, if you're, like all this stuff that we don't really interview people for things like that. But anytime you're working with somebody, that can be a one-time action, takes a little bit more effort up front, but then all of a sudden it pays off every time you work with them in the future. So those are some other examples of ones that I think people often overlook, but that can pay back again and again and don't have to do with software or technology.
Yeah, I love that idea of interviewing. I remember hearing it's like if you want to get good at a skill, you can kind of read the top 3 books on Amazon for copywriting and get kind of that 80/20 like benefit out of it. And this is the same thing. It's like if you're going to be having to hire a plumber all throughout your life for these different things, it's like you
Right.
do that now, you talk to a handful of people, and now you've given yourself that, 80% of the way there.
Great examples are anything you got to do repeatedly, so like, yeah, if you're going to see a therapist every month, or if you're going to go to a doctor, multiple times a year, or your dentist or things like that. This is such a weird one. My wife makes fun of me, but I love my dentist. And part of it was I looked at almost everyone in the city to figure out who I wanted to go to. It was like, I looked at like 8 different options or something. And so, yeah, it seems excessive. Nobody's like, they're just like, I want to get my teeth cleaned. I don't want to spend time like going to 8 different dentists. But now like I'm going to be with them for the next 40 years. Right. So I think that a lot of the time, a little extra effort up front, you don't need to be perfect about it. I think your point about 80/20 is probably the right way to think about it. You're just like, look, the payoff of consistently working with people who are in the top, let's say 10% of what they do is high. If you're working with you're always working with the landscaper, a dentist, a doctor, a therapist, a whoever that's in the top 10%, that's great. Like that really ends up having a collective impact on your life. And I think you can do that. It's not actually that hard. You just need to interview, 3, 4, 5 different options or whatever. And you can usually find somebody who's like definitely near the top of the stack.
So, what makes a good dentist for James Clear?
You know what? One of the reasons I really like him, it's kind of hilarious because it's not even that much about the dentistry work, although they do a great job with that. I really appreciate them because they're an incredibly well-run business. So like when I go there, it's kind of like me geeking out on the entrepreneurial side of things because I don't run a brick and mortar business, but if you look at what they do at how they hire, the people that they have, the way they follow up. I get text message and email birthday messages from them, which is just hilarious to me. It's like so excessive for your dentist to contact you in 2 different ways on your birthday, but I get both. The way that they follow up to remind you to schedule, the way that they upsell their other services throughout the practice, just like it's all very clean and very well done. It's like they're practicing all these core business principles, but they're never stepping too far. They're never doing it like in an annoying way, but they just like print so much more money because of the way they have it structured. So anyway, what I like about it is I feel like if they're that dialed in on the business side, I actually feel better about trusting them on the health and like dentistry side. It's like they're doing things the right way, and I like happen to believe that that's going to bleed throughout everything that the practice does.
Yeah. It's like that idea, I forget what band it is, but where they put in their kind of like waiver that you have to take out all the brown M&Ms and then they use
Oh yeah,
that. It's
yeah,
like
yeah,
if you
yeah.
didn't
Who
take them
was
out,
that?
then you probably didn't set it. I don't, was this
Yeah,
like
that's been the story.
Aerosmith
It's
or
like
Rolling
Metallica
Stones or
or Rolling
something?
Stones or somebody. Yeah,
Yeah.
they would just have, it was like item 57 or something on this super long list, and then they could just walk in and like if all the brown M&Ms were in the bowl, they knew that like they weren't paying attention to details.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Um, so one of the things you talk about that I think is kind of like people probably don't want to hear about is like at a certain point you kind of just have to fall in love with the boredom that accompanies building these longer term habits where it's like there's a lot that you can do and you kind of go through all of the tactics and strategies in the book of how to make it as easy as possible, but at a certain point when you're trying to go to those more complex levels, it's like there is an element of boredom that you have to get comfortable with. How do you deal with that and what do you recommend for people?
Yeah, this is one of the challenges of building habits, which is that the more that you do something, the more routine and expected it becomes. And the more routine and expected it becomes, the less it surprises you. So it loses novelty. And when experiences lose novelty and lose surprise, it becomes a little bit harder for them to delight you because you know exactly what to expect. And so once you've kind of established the habit, sometimes it starts to develop this feeling of it being a little boring, a little monotonous because you know what's coming. So, to a sense, mastery sort of requires you to fall in love with boredom because you have to stick with something long enough to actually master it. You have to stick with it longer than most people who, once it gets boring, they move on to something else, or they kind of are continually cycling through, jumping from one program to the next without actually sticking to anything for a long time. So I think partially just realizing that and knowing that can be helpful. Just being like, oh, okay, the people who really master something, they kind of fall in love with boredom. They fall in love with that process, the predictable outcomes that that are coming their way. So knowing that helps a little bit. But I do think that there's a strategy that you can use, which is basically finding endlessly new details to obsess over. So like, as an example, I'll give you two examples. So first, let's take writing. I've written a couple hundred articles now. I've written a book. I've been writing probably as kind of my primary thing for 6 to 8 years now. So writing the next article, it's kind of like, okay, I sort of know how this goes. Like maybe, it's not as exciting as it used to be. However, I can pick some detail of the process and get really fascinated about that. So as an example, let's say that for the next article, I really wanted to master the introductory sentence. And so I could pull off like 5 or 6 of my favorite books off the shelf. Let's check how they start each chapter. What's the intro sentence? Then let's dump all those into a spreadsheet. Go to the New York Times. What are the most popular articles on the site right now? What are the introductory sentences for each of those? Dump those into the spreadsheet. Basically just build out this database of great intro sentences. And then once I got 100 options or so, I go through that list. Is there anything there that I can learn? Are there patterns that I could use? Or is there a method here that maybe would apply well to this article I'm working on? So the process of writing the article is the same as before, but I've got a new detail to focus on. And that makes it exciting in some new way, even though I'm still sticking to the boring habit in the bigger way. Same sort of story for exercise. So I've been training in the gym for 10 years or so now. And sometimes I'll do front squats, which is where you put the bar on the front of your shoulder. And my dad told me a couple months ago about this it's called a cue in weightlifting that I hadn't heard before, which is if you're doing front squats and you think about pushing your elbows out, everybody thinks about keeping them up, but if you think about pushing them out, it straightens your upper back naturally. And that keeps you in a better position for the lift. Well, okay, let's say I'm going to the gym and, doing these exercises, same exercises I'm always doing. So it starts to feel a little boring. But that day, when I'm doing front squats, I can focus on keeping my elbows out and maintaining good position. So now I've got something new to think about, even though the habit itself is the same. So I think that process of trying to find new details to get interested in can help keep things fresh or interesting, or at least, curious enough so that you stick with the process and don't just give up because you're like, oh, I'm doing the same thing that I was before.
Oh, I love that. It allows you to just like manufacture a novelty into something that you've been making routine for months or years.
Right. That's a good way to put it. You're manufacturing novelty. You're finding a new detail to get fascinated about. And I think in a lot of ways, mastery is not only falling in love with boredom, it's continually manufacturing novelty, continually finding new details to get fascinated about as you repeat the process again and again.
I'm excited to layer that in. That's super cool. So one of the things I don't think you touch on in Atomic Habits, but it's something you talk about wider is kind of decision making in mental models. And I'd love to, this is something I've been really interested in recently, is like, how do you make decisions under uncertainty, especially nowadays where there's so much uncertainty, whether it's like economically or with your job or your career, or your family, or environmentally or public health wise. Do you have certain mental models that you find yourself turning to more often for decision making under uncertainty?
Yeah, I can think of a couple just kind of off the top of my head. So I generally think about mental models as kind of like concepts or ideas. I mean, in our sphere of the internet, people talk about them a lot, and I think they kind of have developed this they've become almost even more than what they are. Like as you're going through school, every new idea you learn is a mental model. So you're surrounded by it your whole life. So really was just saying is like, you're looking for ideas or concepts that help you make sense of the world and take action. So in situations of uncertainty, there are maybe 2 or 3 that I find particularly useful. The first one is what's called margin of safety. And so it just means like having a buffer for things, so financially, a margin of safety might be having an emergency fund that covers, 3 months or 6 months or a year of, expenses or whatever it is. And the bigger the buffer, the bigger the margin of safety. And you're seeing that play out right now, which is businesses that were sitting on a lot of cash had a huge margin of safety, and they could afford to keep their employees on and pay their salaries and whatnot. Whereas businesses who, their margin of safety was, say, like 9 days, well, then once, they're not operating for 2 weeks, all of a sudden they don't have any money left. So the bigger the margin of safety, the more uncertainty you tend to be able to handle, because you don't know where the unknown is going to come from or what the future holds, but you've got a buffer to like absorb the shock. Another example of margin of safety, not just monetary wise, but showing up to meetings early. If you get to every meeting 20 minutes early and you're driving on your way to there and there's a 10-minute delay because of a detour on the road, well, you had a margin of safety, so it was fine. You're still 10 minutes early. Whereas if you plan on getting there 5 minutes early, now all of a sudden you're 5 minutes late. So the bigger the margin of safety, the more you can accommodate for. And there are all kinds of examples, engineering examples, like if you build a bridge, you plan on a truck going across it that weighs 30,000 pounds, you don't want to build the bridge for 30,000 pounds. You want to build it so that it can hold 80,000 pounds. And you've got a big margin of safety in case some really heavy truck that you've never seen before goes across. So that general idea of having a bigger buffer, I think is an interesting one. There are other like little daily things with that, like always filling your gas tank up when it gets to halfway empty instead of waiting until all the way down, or always charging your phone when it gets to halfway down on the battery rather than letting it run all the way down till you get the notification that says you're almost out of battery. So keeping the margin of safety higher in cases like that, again, helps you accommodate for the uncertainty. So that's the first one. The second one is what I refer to as inversion, but it's basically just like looking at things through the opposite lens. And the reason I bring it up now is during times of uncertainty, innovation is often crucial. What it means is that if something is uncertain, it means that the world is changing, and it's changing in a way that was unexpected. And so because it's changing and because the situation is dynamic and evolving, your strategy often needs to change. And so one good way to do that is to apply this concept of inversion, where you sort of ask, what is the opposite of what I want to achieve? And that what it does is it sort of reveals new strategies that maybe you wouldn't have thought about before. So as an example, a failure pre-mortem is an example of inversion. So you take whatever project you're working on, and you say, all right, we're going to fast forward in our minds. It's 6 months from now. The project has failed. What happened? And so the failure pre-mortem forces you to think through those things that might take you off task. It's like, this is the opposite of what we want to achieve. The project is not a huge success. It was a massive failure. Why did that happen to us? And so it reveals these interesting insights. You can do the same thing with like your personal finances. You could say, all right, most people want to get rich. How would we get poor and lose all the money we have? Okay, we would buy a house that would be the biggest possible house we could afford and max out our mortgage. We would buy a car that was unnecessarily expensive. We would purchase luxury goods. We would sign up for multiple cable services and streaming services and then never revisit them again to see if we should cancel. Like you start coming up with all these things that would just siphon money out. And then, like as I'm saying this right now, I'm like, yeah, I should probably unsubscribe from Hulu. Like I never log in, So that strategies like that, they just help get you to think about things in a different way than you would before. And that can be very useful during times of uncertainty. So those two are helpful. And then the third one that I think is particularly useful is what I guess I would call is like pathways to success. There's probably a better way to term it, but to describe it, a process can be completely random, can be completely uncertain, and there still can be an optimal way to act, despite the fact that you don't know what the outcome is. And there's some mathematics behind this, but one example. So let's say that you have 3 die in your hand. You're going to roll these die, right? And each dice could be, 1 to 6. All right. So if you roll all 3 and you get, say, a 6, a 3, and a 1, now your total is 10, right? But you could also switch the order. So the first one could have been a 3, and then you could get a 6 and then a 1. And it's still 10, but the order of the numbers is just different. All right. So you can do that for a bunch of different things, a bunch of different combinations that add up to the number 10. If you want to roll a 9, You could also do different combinations. You could do like a 6, a 2, and a 1, or a 2, a 6, and a 1. But there's one combination which is the same across the board, which is 3, 3, and 3, right? And so for that outcome, it doesn't matter if you switch the order of which one ends up a 3, because they're all still 3s. It doesn't give you more options for hitting that same number. So because of that, there are more pathways to getting a 10 than there are to getting a 9, because one of those outcomes for a 9, everything's got to be the same. And the long story short is, if you run the numbers on this, you're about 8% more likely to roll a 10 than you are to roll a 9, even though the process is totally random. Nobody knows what the die are going to come up as. There's no way to predict it ahead of time. It's totally uncertain, but you still have greater odds of getting a 10 just because there are more paths to success. And if we're defining success as rolling a 10. You can take that same concept and apply it to any uncertain outcome in life. I want my book to be a bestseller. All right. I don't know if that's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty around it. How can I create more pathways to possible success? Well, I could do more podcast interviews. Maybe one of those will take off and go viral. I don't know which one, but the more that I do, the more paths I have to a potential successful outcome. And on and on and on. So applying that same kind of idea to the different areas in your life, how can I create multiple options where something could go right, or where I could get my desired outcome, just like having tons of options for rolling a 10. So anyway, I should say, I haven't been able to stop thinking about that example since I first read about it. There's a great book called The Drunkard's Walk by Leonard Moldenau, and it was in there. And I just thought he explained it really well. And that concept, I think, is very underappreciated. I don't think people realize that life can be random. Life can be uncertain. You don't know what the outcome is. And yet there still is an optimal way to act. There still is something for you to do that can increase your odds of success, even though it's just luck. It's just randomness. So in that sense, creating multiple paths to success, or multiple paths to a good outcome, is kind of, even though it's still luck, it's sort of within your control, weirdly, because you're increasing your exposure to something good to happen, right? You're increasing your surface area for luck. And that's sort of one of the, I think, key strategies that you could employ. And really, you probably could use it anytime, but it's particularly helpful during times of uncertainty. So margin of safety, inversion, and multiple paths to success. I think those three are three solid mental models.
I love that. That reminds me of Nassim Taleb's kind of barbell model, where what you're using with the book is like, you have a very conservative and a very aggressive approach. And like, the conservative is like, what's within my control. I can completely control how this book turns out. I can make sure it's super solid. And then on the aggressive side, I can make a lot of small little bets where one of them has the potential to like exponentially take everything to the next level.
Right. Yeah. There's so many ways to apply that line of thinking. I need to read more of Taleb's work. I'm obviously, familiar with it, but that idea of like exposing yourself to positive asymmetry, giving yourself like this, you're taking these chances. There's so many things that are like that. Even writing a tweet is like that. So all you lose is the 2 minutes that it takes to write something. But then you post it and it could potentially go viral. 5,000 people could read it, or, get 10,000 retweets or whatever. And that in that sense, if you try your best each time you send out a tweet, it's like placing a little bet, or almost like a little lottery ticket that could get cashed in. And so again, you don't know which one is going to take off, but you're giving yourself that exposure to something good happening. So, and that's just with a tweet, right? Like, there are much better ways to do it with building a business, or, all kinds of other stuff. So, yeah, I think those are definitely some powerful ideas.
I love that. One of the last things I would love to talk about is, I've been telling everybody in my life who will listen about the Clear Habit Journal. I got it 2 weeks ago, and I've posted all over Slack, told all my friends about it. It's my favorite notebook that I've ever got, and that is not just awesome, blowing smoke. I would love to hear more about it and share it with folks about like, what was the thinking behind it, because it's the perfect balance of kind of like function and structure with unstructure, and you can kind of adapt it to your own uses.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. I spent probably a year designing it with the Baron Fig team. And I wanted that, what you just described, that for it to have enough structure that you kind of like your hand was held when you need it, and it kind of like gets you going. But it's not so structured that it's just a template that you don't want to use. You use it like once, and then it's like, oh, now all these pages are not useful. So anyway, the original thinking behind it is I wanted to create a workout journal. And so that's usually, I mentioned this earlier, that's where I actually journal the most, is by recording my workouts by hand. And so I thought, oh, I'll just make something that I would want to use in the gym. But then as we started getting into it, I was like, well, actually, I think there's a way to create this structure so that it can be used not just in the gym, but for journaling in general, or for taking notes in meetings, or all kinds of stuff. So my first thought was, most of the time when people use notebooks, they're writing about notes or journaling or all kinds of other things. Like, they don't really need structure. And so the vast majority of the pages are just that dot grid notebook that you can use for pretty much anything. But then there are a couple particular practices that I think are useful. And if you don't have these templates, they take a long time to draw and create. So like the habit tracker, there's 12 habit tracking templates in the back. And it's like, look, you could draw your own habit tracker on a page in your notebook, and there are plenty of people who do that. But we're going to save you a lot of time if you don't have to draw it each time, because you got to make a little cell for every day of the month and everything. So I think that's helpful to have those there, and people just like, kind of marking things down. And then the other one was sort of that 1 line per day section, which if you talk to people about journaling, a lot of them understand that journaling is helpful. They're like, yeah, of course, like there are benefits to it. But it kind of seems like too big of a thing. It's like, I don't have that much to write about. Like, I don't fill out a whole page every day. Like, I don't know. It's just like, maybe I'll do it for a day or two or a week, but then I fall off course. And so I was like, well, what if we just made it as easy as possible? You just write 1 sentence each day. Like, that's it. And so I think it kind of, in that sense, it sort of aligns with a lot of the concepts that I write about in Atomic Habits, where we're just trying to help you show up and get something down. And then you can look back on each month and kind of review it. But anyway, I'm curious to hear how you're using it, what sections you find helpful, because it still is a relatively new product. So I'm certainly open to lots of feedback.
Yeah. I mean, I have been actually using it for morning journaling. So the habit I've been tracking has been morning pages. And so I've done
Nice.
that for the past, I backfilled it because I only got this journal about 2 weeks ago, but I backfilled it because I started journaling January 11th, haven't missed a day. And then have been also doing the line a day right there, which
Nice.
is,
Yeah.
I've been filling it in a bit too much. But no, I think what has actually been most useful, which if you were going to do a version 2 of it, is adding more of the toolkits at the back, because I find those super valuable. Like, it was really cool going through like the first, second, third order consequences. I think that's cool. Some of the decision making framework. So man, I would take as many of those as there are.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that the notebook had like content in there so that people could understand how powerful it could be, right? Like, if they get it and it's just a template, then you don't fully see what you could unpack with it. But yeah, like that section on second order thinking, or first, second, third order consequences. There's some productivity methods in there. Yeah, it's all. I'm glad to hear you found it useful. I was hoping people would see that and realize that, oh, actually, this can be much more than just a place to take some notes.
Yeah. Well, and there's not so much in it, where a lot of the journals will have first 50 pages are like text, and you're like, well, I don't want to buy another version of this, because then it's just another 50 pages that are wasted, where it's a very efficient use of space as well, where buying
Yeah,
another
that's a
one
real
doesn't feel
downside.
like.
You don't want to waste pages. I'd rather give people notebook pages. Like, I don't want this thing to be like 800 pages thick. Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, that's great,
No,
man. Thank you for
it's awesome. And we got Baron Fig to give everyone at the Remote Academy a 15% off for all of the Clear Habit stuff. So I can post that here, because you can get the pick up the book, pick up the journal. I have the large one. There's 2 sizes. I think the large one's bomb. And there's also a pen that goes along with it. So I'm going to post that in the chat for everybody. You can get 15% off all of
Oh,
that.
that's sweet. I didn't know you did that. That's nice.
Yeah, they're sponsoring the
I
conference.
like both sizes. I think I prefer the large one too, actually. I didn't think I was going to at first, because it's a little bigger than what I would usually want. But now that I've actually used it, I think that I like the additional real estate. Anyway.
Well, what's the to wrap this up? Thank you so much for being so generous with your time here. I know you're on a ton of interviews right now. What is the one action people could take now to kind of start locking in their habits? If they have one in mind that they really want to develop now while they're in quarantine, where should they start?
Yeah. Well, so let me give two answers. So the first answer is like, how do I pick which habit? And obviously, if you got something that's exciting to you, just go ahead and do that. But if you're not sure, there is what I would call like a class of habits that I guess we'd call like meta habits, in the sense that they sort of unlock a lot of other things or other habits. So as example, sleep is a good meta habit. If you get good sleep, then you're in a better position for any other habit that you build during the day. But my kind of preferred one is reading, because if you can build the habit of reading, then you sort of can unlock any other problem that you're facing. Like if you want to learn how to be a better cook, great. We have tons of cooking books. You can read those. If you want to learn how to start a podcast, you can read a book on that. If you want to learn how to, design a home and do architecture, you can read a book about that. Like there's pretty much any problem that you're interested in, you can read a book on it. And so building the habit of reading unlocks a lot of other stuff down. It's like, it's upstream of many other solutions. So I would say picking maybe some kind of meta habit like that, like reading or sleep or whatever. That said, if you're looking to build a habit and like implement it, I think the place I would recommend starting is what I call the 2-minute rule. And the 2-minute rule just says, take whatever habit you're trying to build and scale it down to something that takes 2 minutes or less to do. So if it's reading, for example, then, instead of read 30 books a year, that becomes read 1 page. Or do yoga 4 days a week becomes take out my yoga mat. And sometimes I explain that and people resist it a little bit. They're kind of like, okay, like I know the real goal isn't just to take my yoga mat out each time. I know I actually want to do the workout. So if this is some kind of mental trick, then like, why would I fall for it, basically? But I got this guy, his name's Mitch, a reader, and I mentioned him in Atomic Habits. He ended up losing over 100 pounds. And for the first 6 weeks that he went to the gym, he had this rule for himself where he wasn't allowed to stay for longer than 5 minutes. So you get in the car, drive to the gym, get out, do half an exercise, get back in the car, drive home. And it sounds ridiculous, it sounds silly. You're like, this is not going to get the guy the results that he wants. But if you step back, what you realize is he was mastering the art of showing up. And he was becoming the type of person that went to the gym 4 days a week, even if it was only for 2 minutes. And so the point is that, and this I think is a much deeper truth about habits, a habit must be established before it can be improved, right? It has to become the standard in your life before you can worry about optimizing and scaling it up. And for some reason, we get so locked into like finding the best workout program, the ideal diet plan, the perfect business idea, right? We're so focused on optimizing that we don't give ourselves permission to show up, even if it's just in a small way. And so the 2-minute rule sort of helps you overcome that. It helps you overcome that tendency to bite off more than you can chew and master the art of showing up. I'm reminded, there's this great quote by Ed Lattimore where he says, the heaviest weight of the gym is the front door. And it's sort of like, it's that idea, like in the beginning, your job is to master the art of showing up. After that, then you can scale it up and optimize later. So I would say the 2-minute rule is a good place to start.
Awesome. That's great. Well, James, thank you very much for making the time for this conversation. I've looked up to you and your content for a really long time. So this was a real treat for me. I appreciate it. And everyone here, let's give James a huge round of applause. And yeah, go pick up the book, pick up the journal, pick up the pen. All awesome. It's in the comments, 15% off Bear and Fig for any of the Clear Habit products. And James, thank you very much, and best of luck with the new book you're working on. Can't wait to pick up a copy.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.